us. And we're going to ask Derek Spires to start us off.
I'm back. So my journey with Porter. Porter's work, especially this volume, Early Negro Writing, was my first introduction to the world of what we now think of as Black print culture. I was in graduate school at the time and trying to figure out how to talk about texts like Absalom Jones and Richard Allen's 1794 narrative of the proceedings of the Black people, which was their account of the 1793 yellow fever epidemic in Philadelphia. And I was also becoming aware of a host of Black ephemeral and periodical writing that my previous training and the paradigms I had encountered in undergrad and grad school just weren't holding up to talk about. There were these things I was coming across and I didn't know what to do with them. And I was talking this over with my undergraduate mentor, Dr. Jerry Ward from Tougaloo College. I'm a HBCU alum. And he told me to get a copy of Dorothy Porter's Early Negro Writing. Like that was gonna solve everything. My life was gonna be done. Porter, that's it. And he wasn't wrong. As my colleagues here know, Porter draws attention to the importance of how we frame Black writing, and how she framed early Negro writing gave her and me wide latitude with the kinds of things I could consider in a way that didn't necessarily leave literature and literariness behind, and didn't confine Black writing to protest and enslavement, but included spirituals, sermons, and the like. I was in the literature department, and people were really concerned that I make myself look like an English professor, not a historian. Porter's wasn't the only connection of Black writing available. Even in her day, texts like Herbert Aptheker's A Documentary History of the Negro in the United States was available, but the distinction in Porter's work is written in Aptheker's title, Documentary History, where many collections frame Black writing for their evidentiary value, for their historical nature. Porter consistently from the 1930s on drew attention to the artistic value of this work, which she described as the beginnings of the Afro-Americans' artistic consciousness, the first articulations of the appeal of beauty and the moral sense. Porter proceeded with the assumption that underwrites much of the field that has followed her. Assume that there's a there, that Black writers were producing a literature and print culture on their own terms and in ways that included but could not be reduced to protest. Importantly, Porter's work also introduced me to a host of Black women writers like Jarena Lee, Mariah Stewart, Sarah Parker Remond, as well as Black women's literary societies. Porter in this way, her work in this way is grounded in Black feminist practices at a time when Black masculinist narratives dominated the landscape. So Porter basically set the foundation for my scholarship. It initiated a fundamental shift in how I thought about and valued early Black writing. And it's also become the anchor for how I conceive graduate seminars and undergraduate seminars. Like if a graduate student comes to me saying they want to get to know early Black writing, the first thing I do is point them towards early Negro writing. It's the first thing. And that book, in my short time, has launched dissertations, articles, and careers. I've only been at this for a few years, but I wouldn't be here without Porter's work. Thank you.
Okay, so I think I'm slated to go next. So I want to echo the thanks to the BSA as well as to Laura and Derek for arranging this panel, and incredibly excited to be able to talk about Porter's work. I have more informal remarks about my relationship to Porter, my introduction to her work, but hopefully we'll have a more substantial conversation from there. I was first introduced to Dorothy Porter in undergrad. I went to Howard for college. And so Dorothy Porter's name was like so many other names, Elaine Locke, Sterling Brown, Ralph Bunche, like names that we associated with the institution. And especially if you did research at the Mullen Spinger Research Center, as I did, you knew that Dorothy Porter was a librarian, like the librarian who transformed that institution, but I didn't necessarily get how influential she was beyond Howard's campus until I was in graduate school. So I was a graduate student at Yale when Porter's papers came to Yale. And so it was very fortunate, the timing of that, because I had just decided that I thought I was going to move in the direction of studying Black archives, but I didn't necessarily know what angle to kind of approach. And so I absolutely think that Porter's papers fundamentally shifted the way in which I approach my work, my thinking about the research, and my understanding of the value of libraries, the value of Black archives, similar to what Derek had said, because as you go through those boxes and boxes of material, even in their slightly processed state, you become aware of how central Porter was as she's talking to throughout different decades, as she's talking to different generations, whether it's Jessie Moreland, whether it's Carter G. Woodson, all the way up until the 1970s, and helping to guide this younger generation of scholars. So as I'm looking through the project that she's involved in addition to Sarah Parker Redmond, she's researching William Cooper Nell, like she's going back and forth between so many different time periods that I started to think about Black archives and Black libraries as really this site of exchange, where usually my run of names is that scholars, writers, students, artists, teachers, parents, like all of them are intersecting with Black archives, whether it's at the Moreland Library or elsewhere. And it became a unique way of thinking through this transition that's happening and how we think about Black history that's specifically centered on Black archives or Black libraries. And the only way that I could access that was through the example of Dorothy Porter. And so I think even her legacy, her example also informs the way in which I teach, the way in which I encourage people to think about history, is that it's inevitably an interdisciplinary conversation, because she had to be as broad in her thinking as she was, because she was so foundational, and the ways in which those threads and fragments kind of come together, she set the tone for what that caliber of scholarship could ultimately become. So again, very influential, and I'm excited to be able to see what the conversation will be.
I'm going to pick it up here and echo what Melanie said, that it's often hard to trace the intellectual history of librarians. They made tools for research for other people to use, but they rarely wrote treatises of their own. But we're really lucky that Dorothy Porter did leave a paper trail of her work. So like Melanie, I want to acknowledge the two repositories that make research on her possible. Her administrative records are in the university archives at the Moreland Spingarn Research Center at Howard, and her personal papers, as Melanie said, are at the Beinecke Library at Yale. And they're both tremendous collections that should invite a lot more scholarship in the future. It was with a BSA fellowship in 2010 that I first used Porter's records at Moreland Spingarn, so it's coming full circle today. I want to describe a little bit about where that research led me by giving an overview of Porter's cataloging practice and her bibliographic method that I think will help us think about her legacy in the next part of our conversation. So as curator of the Moreland collection, much of Porter's work in the 1930s was about creating a capacious taxonomy to order Black knowledge through bibliography, classification, and cataloging. This was pioneering intellectual work that really created a scaffolding for the field of Black studies and for critical bibliography today. To organize the Moreland collection, Porter had to wrestle with the 1927 edition of the Dewey Decimal Classification. In most libraries, there were only 2 Dewey numbers that were used for works on Black subjects, and that was 326 for slavery and 325.26, a number for colonies and migration that was designated as a place for works on the so-called Negro question. In other words, in most libraries, Black subjects were placed either under slavery or in a section reserved for works on people foreign to the nation in the context of the United States. Porter recalled that in many white libraries, even the Book of American Negro Poetry by James Weldon Johnson would be shelved at 325.26. Like Porter, most Black librarians rejected Dewey's number for the Negro question, and they refused to use it. They had long known, as an earlier librarian at Howard had written, that no library in the country has a classification suitable for our purpose, hence one must be created. Porter took it upon herself to invent that classification. She wasn't the only librarian to author an expansion of Dewey. Many librarians of special collections needed more detailed classifications for their materials. But the stakes for Porter were higher because it was not simply that prevailing bibliographies and cataloging systems lacked detail about Black topics, it was that they were outright hostile to Blackness as a subject of knowledge production. And so Porter had to develop methods that took on that hostility. She was one of the first African-American women, as Derek said, at Columbia University's library school. When she told her professors that she wanted to write a thesis on early Negro writing, this was in the late 1920s, it eventually became this book in 1971, her professors dismissed the idea, and they said there was not enough Black writing before 1835 to warrant a bibliographic study. She had to get a letter of authorization from Vernon Loggins, a white professor of literature, before her topic was approved. For most critics, there was no Black literature before William Wells Brown or Francis Harper or Frederick Douglass. To prove that idea wrong, in her bibliographic pursuits, Porter developed an expansive idea of Black authorship. She looked not only for single authored texts like the poetry of Phillis Wheatley, but also for collectively authored objects like hymnals and convention proceedings. In her cataloging, as in her bibliographic work, Porter surfaced Black print culture where it was hidden. So she would take a book like Charles Braden's These Also Believe, which the Library of Congress gave just one subject heading for religious sects, and she would add the term Father Divine in the Moreland catalog so that it became discoverable in a search for works on Black religion. In rewriting the Dewey Decimal Classification, she turned Dewey's 10 subdivisions under slavery into 100. She authored detailed classifications for the Freemasons and the AME Church, and she wholly rewrote sections of Dewey, which contravened accepted cataloging practice at the time. She retitled all of the American history categories to center Black history. So she turned 973.7 from the War of Secession to the Negro during the Civil War. She turned 973.8, Andrew Johnson, to Emancipation, and so on. She also invented a special class for works on the African diaspora that did not fit within the national divisions of Dewey's taxonomy. Her vision was that she wanted to share this classification with librarians at other HBCUs, but the Dewey editor forbade her from distributing it. Porter, though, was an expert at clandestine maneuvers. So when she published the widely circulated catalog of books in the Moreland Foundation in 1939, she quietly embedded her custom Dewey numbers in it so that other librarians could pick them up. By the late 1960s, when libraries at white institutions were scrambling to build Black Studies collections in response to student demands, Porter taught other librarians to think more creatively about where Black print culture could be found, how it was hidden, and what kinds of cataloging it needed. She advised them not only to acquire materials that they had once shunned or overlooked, but also to change the way that they understood their existing materials. She played a major role, for example, in persuading the Library Company of Philadelphia to produce Afro-Americana, a 1973 catalog that made visible for the first time its vast holdings on early African-American history. There's still much of that work to be done. A few years ago, Simon Gikandi asked, could one be a revolutionary and still love the library? Porter did love the library, but I think if she were here today, she would argue that there's still much revolutionary work to be done within the stacks and the catalog. So I hope we'll talk about that as the hour proceeds. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, I want to thank everyone for having me join today. It's very humbling to be speaking with everyone who are such great scholars and experts in Dorothy Porter's work. And it's also just very nice to hear people say my name so often. But my introduction to Dorothy Porter is actually somewhat more recent, I think, and in certain ways less in depth and more as a practitioner than some of my scholarly colleagues. I learned about her work, I think, through Laura's work, and then really dove in. And what struck me and continues to strike me is how much Dorothy Porter's writing and methodologies reflect things that I, sort of foolishly for not reading my genealogies beforehand, but that I taught myself in terms of identifying and describing materials to make African-American archival materials more discoverable. I think especially rereading her article, thinking of where she speaks on how she had to just gather a list of names first by framing a list of authors' names, and how much that sort of practice is still what's necessary in most of our catalogs and finding aids to discover African American materials, you know, and really bringing up this sort of idea of, if we're choosing to not have these new sorts of descriptive systems like Porter created, then we can't have discovery. And now, as an archivist working in 2020, and how much, you know, authorities have become so deeply standardized and so heavily based on, you know, common denominator, still coming up against these recurrent issues of catalog displays that are clearly not designed to make African American materials discoverable, and coming against issues about description that are much more focused on sort of an idea of a process than patron discoverability or maintaining historical record. And so I guess to think of how Dorothy Porter's work has affected my current work, it's actually quite deeply, some theoretically, as I've described a little bit, but also in a very practical sense. At Houghton Library, which is Harvard's largest manuscripts and rare books repository, I'm leading a digitization project that I came up with to digitize a large amount, not all because Houghton is somewhat incalculable, a large collection of our African American materials related to slavery, emancipation, abolition, and freedom. So we've identified over 3,500 records in our collection, and one of the tools I used for identifying those records was in fact Dorothy Porter's checklist of materials. She has things that are labeled HCL for Harvard College Library because that's where they were at the time, but most of those materials have been transferred over to Houghton as their rarity and importance has become more recognized. And also because Harvard is so old, a lot of times things that are in the circulating stacks here would be the rarest materials somewhere else, just based on the timeline. But going through her work has really always provided a guide to me in how to bring a level of scholarship and professionalism to the sort of things that I was saying I've come to more autodidactically. And that is both important, I think, in terms of representing the work of Black archivists and librarians as a serious type of scholarly work in its own right, and also important in continuing the work that she did throughout her life of really establishing to others that this is important work that takes scholarship and not sort of chance. I think that there's always sort of there's an idea in a lot of these libraries that we don't have a lot of African American material, the same sort of ideas that Porter came up against when she wanted to write, you know, her dissertation on early Negro writings. And this idea of, is there not material there, or do you just not know about it and think that things you don't know about must not be important? And I think it's still something that we come up against a lot, and that she provides such a fantastic example in counteracting.
Afternoon, everyone. And I also want to thank you for inviting me on this program today. It was truly an honor, and it's an honor to hear the research that you all are doing as it relates to Dorothy Porter Wesley. I was introduced to her work when I was working at the Martin Luther King Library in DC in the Black Studies Division. And she retired the year before I came to Moreland Spingarn. But I was also able to see her a lot because she was still very, very, very active. So a lot of times she really encouraged us. I want to talk about it from a personal level since I knew her. She really encouraged us, the librarians, and she really talked to us about how to help people that came into the library. We had people that were coming to the library that were from all over. We had Fulbright scholars. We had students that were there on the campus just working, maybe wanting to just get a paper for a conference, for their class. She also helped a lot of the faculty on the campus because they were trying to write books themselves, and they were also, she gave them materials that they could use in their classrooms for their students. So there was a wide variety of people that she had to look up, that she was going to be able to help that would come into the library. So people came from all over, but she did have a love for her Howard students and for the Howard faculty. As you know, they used to call Dorothy Porter in her collecting. they used to call her the shopping bag lady. And there was an old saying that when someone would die, that as the curse, as the undertaker was taking the body out, Dorothy was coming in with her shopping bag to get the materials. So she got lots and lots of materials. She collected things that people didn't think were important at the time, like posters and things of that nature. And so that's why the collection is such a wide variety of materials in the collection, because she thought that many things were important and that it all went together once when you started studying history. You not only had to have the written material, you had to have things like posters and letters and things of that nature to bring your history together. So she was very, very active. Some of the people that she helped on campus, Sterling Brown was there, Arthur P. Davis, Rayford Logan. So all of those people she helped as far as trying to make sure that they had materials not only for their classes, but for their research. And she had a variety of interests, as you have all talked about today. So she wrote on many, many different things. And I think that's why she was so popular, because usually when someone came in to do research, she could tell them more about their topic than they knew. So that's another reason they like to talk to her, because she really researched and she knew a lot about the topics that people were doing research on. And she was also trying to introduce people to new topics. Sometimes, especially when you're a student, you might want to do the regular people that you normally know, Booker T. Washington, Miriam Clyde Bethune, Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, and she would try to introduce you to other people and other events that you could write about, so that you could, that was trying to get the history out there. She was also very active with, of course, the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, founded by Carter G. Woodson. And in fact, when she came there, she actually came in 28 as a catalog, and then 30 she was made head of the collection. Well, she knew very little about Black history, so she went to Carter G. Woodson, who started the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History at that time, and they worked together. So he was doing, he had his own publishing company, Associated Publishers. He started what was then the Negro History Bulletin, which was for young people. He started the Journal of Negro History, which was where the scholars would get published. And his publishing company published Black books, because at that time, Black books were not being published by most mainstream publishers. So she really worked hard with the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, and always came to the conferences. She was on the executive council. Later on, I became part of the executive council. And whenever we went to the conference, she was the belle of the ball, because almost anybody that was doing research had to come to Moreland Spingarn. If you're doing a book or anything, an article, you had to come to Moreland Spingarn to do your research. So she pretty much knew everybody. So, and she helped everybody. They would come there. As I talk about my approach to the field and my research, she was extremely helpful. When I started publishing my bibliographies with Greenwood Press, I would take my 3x5 cards to her home, and she would give me feedback and recommendations on my topic. But she did that for everybody. And she was so very supportive of me and other scholars, especially those of us who had started working in Black women's history, because when I came to Howard, they started, that was when Black history courses were becoming popular, and then Black women's history courses as well. So she helped a lot of the faculty get their resources together so they could teach these courses. And she was especially supportive of us who were doing women's history stuff. She would come to our program. She would give us resources. I even think she helped financially when me and a lady by the name of Ruby Sales had a program that we brought senior African-American women to DC to talk about their careers. Well, as I thought about it years later, I figured out that North Dakota must have been paying those folks to come, because Ruby and I didn't have any money to pay them. We just had money for refreshments. But they would come down from New York and Delaware. Most anybody that we would ask, they usually would come down and we'd have this little program. And she would always be at the program. So she just would go out of her way to help all of us who were actually doing research. And there were so many, many people that she helped. In my book, one of the things I tried to talk about in the book that I did on Dorothy Porter was we were doing this for History Press, and History Press wants to do general history book. So it didn't have to be real scholarly, but they wanted general history books that the general public would like to read. So what I tried to do, I talked to a lot of people that worked with her, and that she helped. John Hope Franklin, for instance, when he came to Howard, he was researching, and she found a letter that helped him to work on his research. So she did all kinds of things. She helped Charles Box and all kinds of people that she was there that would come to the center to do research. So I was really appreciative of the fact that she took us under her wing and just kind of showed us the way. Thank you.
Thank you all for those amazing comments to kind of get us started and get us thinking about Porter from all these different perspectives. We want to invite all of you all to type your questions that you might have into the Q&A box. And while you're thinking about that, I want to start off with a question for our panelists, which is, how do you see Porter's work continuing now? How can we build on her legacy? And I'll let whoever wants to start jump in.
Well, I'll go ahead and start. I think her legacy is the Moreland Spingarn Research Center, the library she built at Howard University, where researchers, students, and scholars still come today to do research. She also left a legacy she was also a public historian, working with many organizations. I told you about the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, Carter G. Woodson. Of course, she was very, very active in the African Studies Association, the National Council of Negro Women. With the NCNW, she helped them with their archives on Black women's history to get that started. And she also helped them with their journal that they used to have called the Afro-American Woman's Journal. So she was very, very active in trying to help as many people. So she belonged to all these organizations. Almost anybody that was doing anything, of course, came to Dorothy Porter Wesley. I think her legacy also continues in librarians like me, who she not only helped with research, but also encouraged us to publish. And I think her legacy is moving forward with scholars like you on the program today who are continuing research about her. One of the things about my book, as I said, it was not a scholarly book, and there is, Dorothy Porter Wesley deserves a scholarly study of her life's work. The archives at Yale have not been fully processed from what I understand. I understand there is a new finding aid out there on her. Now, she had 2 husbands, and James Porter's collection went to Emory University, and that has been processed. And her second husband, Charles Wesley, his papers, the Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity bought his papers, and they are now at Howard University, but they have not been processed yet. So she deserves a real, but I think the Yale papers need to really be processed, because that's what most of the materials are. When I was there, I only was able to go through 18 or 20 boxes of that 127 boxes of materials on her. So a lot of research I didn't get a chance to talk about too much in the book, because I didn't see a lot of that when I was there. So that collection really needs to be, before I think, a real scholarly book. But she deserves a scholarly study of her life.
Well, I can go next because I think some of my comments echo what Janet said. I absolutely agree there needs to be a scholarly biography of Porter and more scholarly studies of her work, but I'm glad that at least Janet has started that process. The comments that I had about what it would look like to build upon or to continue Porter's legacy, I think at the center of what she does really was a recovery project. And similar to what Janet was saying, I've been a fan of the many processing projects that have happened over the last 2 decades, of people going into these quote unquote hidden collections and helping to process them, make them accessible, and also to digitize them. And so I think that specifically at historically Black colleges, I think that there's a need to kind of build on that work. I was very glad to see that the Council of on library and information resources recently had started a partnership with the HBCU Library Alliance. And so hopefully over the next several years, there might be more of these processing projects, because for many years, it was only historically Black institutions that were collecting this material. And so I'm sure that there's more information that's there that will help to change the trajectory of scholarship, as we've all seen. But even from a logistics standpoint, that usually if you come from an under-resourced institution, your research tends to be more local. So I would be very curious about the scholarship that could emerge out of those institutions with those kinds of projects. The second thing that I thought would be, that I see as being connected to Porter's legacy, that's similar also to what Janet was saying with her work with the National Council of Negro Women. There is a program, the Cite Black Women Collective. If you're unfamiliar with it, it's a website, it's a podcast, it's a hashtag. I think it's important for scholars of all backgrounds to affirm the validity and the importance of this work, which is what this panel is doing. But part of recognizing Porter's story and her legacy is also acknowledging her marginalization. So with the Cite Black Women Collective, they're also pointing to this intellectual labor that far too often, as Laura has written, it exists seemingly in the margins, but it's the teachers, the librarians, social workers in these non-traditional fields that can be a wealth of resources and information if we know to look in that direction. So I think those would be the two main areas that I really see it important to shine a light upon them.
Yeah, I just want to echo everything that's said here, and to note that it's not just what Porter did, it's how she did it, and everything she did happened from and for community. She makes the clear argument that Black cataloging, Black bibliography is about Black lives, and Black culture, and sort of serving Black communities. And there are a few projects I can see taking that same ethic, like the Color Conventions project at, I was at Delaware, now at Penn State. Miriam McGraham, Kansas, has been working on the project for the history of Black writing for years, from a like solid Black studies, Black feminist paradigm, focusing on open access, training of students. That's another place where Porter's legacy continues, the training of students as we do the scholarship. It's not just us in our offices and silos doing this work to get published. It's always looking forward to what the next generation is doing. And I'd also note Meredith McGill and Jackie Goldsby, who've been working on the Black Bibliography Project. All of those projects sort of take on Porter's, not only her work and legacy, but her ethos. And that's key moving forward.
I think from my perspective, and I apologize, there's insane construction outside my home that even headphones don't do anything about, so I'm sorry for that. But what I think in terms of her legacy that hasn't been spoken already, everyone's been so thoughtful about her legacy, is also thinking about the ways in which Black cataloging especially, and Black bibliography play themselves out in patron discovery in places that aren't central for Black research. So thinking about things like how a commitment to, name authorities and authorized subject headings in our catalog systems, and a commitment to being shared cataloging in OCLC means that we are not describing African-American materials in a way that's focused on the African-American community or the community of African-American studies researchers. So when we make these commitments, which most of these libraries do at a large scale, to have a shared praxis that has to do with sort of common ground and neutralizing our workloads, that means by its nature that marginalized people's materials will not get a depth of understanding. If you have certain notes fields that don't appear in OCLC, then what's the point of putting them into your catalog records? Even if those notes fields might be the things that help researchers identify the unique connections to African-American history. And I think that can be especially true. I come from an archival background, but that can be especially true when dealing with books, which are cataloged using the non-narrative style that archivists love to be so free with. And thinking especially of materials in which African American history is present and yet is not obvious and maybe doesn't fit how a subject heading would describe. I think of an example recently of a small text I came across called Humor in Ebony, and it is from 1911. And it's a short book that is definitely just a collection of sort of dialect style, white authored back home stories. You know, it's the dedication is to his mammy. Why is this African American history, however? Or what's the deeper relevance is that it's full of beautiful ethnographic photographs from his local community. And while those photographs may have racially inflammatory or mocking captions, they are in fact photographs of individuals in those communities that would be really great for both research purposes in terms of scholarship and also perhaps for some sort of outreach to that community. Those could be, some of them may be the only photos of certain people in that area. And sort of thinking though, there's no way for me to put that in a catalog record. That's not what and you know, that's always the feedback from catalogers and librarians that are very focused on those standards is that's not what subject headings are for. And that's not what description is for. And to me, the question comes down to, and I think Porter in her expert way challenged that, is sort of, if the standards exist for standards' sake, well then what's the point of them? You know, the standards should be for discovery, and sometimes perhaps they should be a prioritized discovery of those stakeholder communities. And I think she provided such a great example. I'm someone who perhaps is more willing, I blame my folklore ethnomusicology type background, to just saying who cares about standards and throwing them out the window. But she provides such a perfect example of challenging those standards while working within and modifying that existing framework. That's really, you know, I at least could learn so much from that and do.
If anyone has any questions you want to type into the Q&A box, I think we have time to answer a couple of questions from attendees. I'll just add to this conversation to say, you know, as Dorothy was talking about, Porter was always playing this kind of inside-outside game against all kinds of obstacles, even within Howard, right? She had a lot of male colleagues who just didn't think that a Black woman should be doing kind of intellectual work, and she had all kinds of strategies kind of work around their objections. But she was working to intervene in these national taxonomies. She worked very closely with the Library of Congress and was helping them to expand their name authorities early on, at the same time that she knew that would never be enough. So she was building this kind of universe of information within Howard's collection where Black subjects really were centered. And so I think it speaks to the question that Dorothy's talking about are some of those local experiments lost when you kind of move into an automated national system. One of the things that Porter envisioned that never quite came to pass was really a kind of a network of Black collections, especially at HBCUs. And that was a kind of unfinished challenge of her work. And I think that might be one place to think about where her legacy might go from here.
We do have one question from a participant, and I'd like to sort of tack a little something onto that too. And the question is, do you consider LibGuides bibliographies? And I would also want to know from this group if you'd be interested in talking a little bit about the role that enumerative bibliography, so that list making, the work that she did to really identify the authors, identify the titles, that's different from in sort of like hardcore bibliography land, descriptive and analytical bibliography of doing like really super intense physical descriptions. I think that, which also is something that doesn't happen in MARC records, to tack on to what Dorothy was talking about. I think that, and I won't go on too much here, I promise, that part of Porter's legacy is, and especially its importance now, is showing us that role that enumerative bibliography can and must play in making sure that legacies survive. So if anyone wants to tackle that, sort of like, what's the role of the LibGuide? Is that a bibliography? And plus my enumerative add-on.
Well, I'll just say that Porter made lots of kinds of lists. She made on mimeograph very short lists for further reading and short bibliographies, what we would now call LibGuides, for students and for people who came through the library for every occasion. And she also made colossal bibliographies that have stayed with us, both early Negro writings, but also her Afro-Brasiliana, which was work that she was doing in the 1940s that very few other people had undertaken. So I think when we're talking about bibliography, I like to think of that expansively, that the smallest of lists can be interventions as well as the biggest ones in both enumerative and descriptive bibliographies. You can't do descriptive bibliography if you don't have enumerative bibliography, if you don't know what the possibilities are, if you don't know what you're looking for.
And I think I'd add to that, even thinking the specifics of like the Union catalog, that ability to identify the specific locations of where items are could be that kind of bridge between the bibliography and the library guide, that making sure that people knew where they could find these smaller like pamphlets or other items is definitely an important aspect of the list making that Laura is describing.
Well, I'll just speak to the LibGuides. I think we have to meet students where they are. And LibGuides have become the best way, I think, of getting the information out to the students, because, and again, a lot of libraries do not collect actual books now, things in ebooks and things of that nature. So I think LibGuides really help us to help the student find the information that they need for the things that they're working on. I really enjoy reading and working on LibGuides.
Yeah, I'd just echo that. I'm probably the least connected to library studies, but the most. But just shout out to Erica Cree here at Cornell, who's our Africana librarian and has now been named the professional titles. He is in charge of Africana collections in our rare and distinctive collections. Right? And he is a master at the LibGuide, and he's been called upon to do any number of LibGuides now that we're all trying to be anti-racist and such. And so those LibGuides become spaces of bibliographical information, but they also become arguments in ways that all bibliographies are, but sort of, but in a more explicit way, right? And also just want to note how many bibliographies Porter did. She did yearly bibliographies of work that was coming out and publishing in journals. She had bibliography of African fiction. And just the sheer volume of text she put out there for us to then go out and do work on is staggering. She added to Schomburg's bibliography of Black poetry. I think maybe doubled it in size. And so just from just knowing there's a there does so much critical work, and seeing, as Laura mentioned, the Afro-Brazilian bibliography and the African fiction bibliography and the early Negro writings bibliography breaks down so many notions about what was possible, what was done, and the like.
We have a few more questions in now. This one asks, are there any particular principles that catalogers / librarians should have in mind when cataloging Black materials in order to make them more easily discoverable in modern cataloging systems? Sort of like a heavy technical question there. So, and if this isn't a heavy cataloging crowd, but
Like, as a non-cataloger, but someone who does describe things quite often, like from a special collections context, I think that something that I often see as an issue is a lack of engagement with the text, which also often comes from a lack of time being given from management to engage with the text. So it's not necessarily, I'm not putting that on the catalogers there, but this sort of, sometimes a lot of the time this material isn't described, especially in special collections context, which is the only one I really know, isn't described as well as it could be or as in depth, because the catalogers and all ad archivists as well, anyone processing collections, don't have the background in this area, don't have the background in African American history and culture. And so the description is in and of itself always going to be somewhat flawed, even if you are using approved headings and everything like that. Let's say it doesn't have any issues with that. An example that I think about quite often is this piece that is in what piece we have a copy of at Houghton and exists other places, a broadside from Boston from 1820 that was titled, Grand Celebration, and I'm just going to speak it. It's written in a false dialect, but I'll just say it. A grand celebration of the abolition of slavery, and from the African Society of Boston. And in the catalog, it is, the creator is listed as the African Society of Boston. It's given the date. It has a description that says, a little bit of information about the back and front, it's special collections cataloging, and appropriate subject headings about abolition and the African Society of Boston, etc. Now, the issue with that is, and I'm not going to, this is not a record made at Houghton. It's a record, we got it through OCLC. So going back to my other problem. The problem with this record, though, is if you were to do further research, it becomes clear that every year, local anonymous white citizens of Boston would make parody broadsides of the African Society of Boston's emancipation event. Because when I first saw this catalog entry, my first thought was, it's very strange that the African Society of Boston would write their own broadsides in broad dialect. Why would they call themselves the African Society of Boston? I don't think that makes sense. So doing that further, having that basic knowledge of that's not how, especially in that moment, educated African Americans, that's not how they're going to write their public announcements about their events. This clearly isn't that. But now, because it's in the system, I can't even just go in and change the creator, because that's an authorized heading and it's actually a record from OCLC. So we would need to contact the host institution to have them change their rec. And this is that sort of thing where it's this big complicated system that serves, I don't know. But at the end of the day, the person who was processing that, I would bet based on my experience in technical services, was not given a lot of time to do that extra research if that's not their background. So to be truly fair, it's not a question of, and I think sometimes it can feel this way for researchers, I think especially because I hear this complaint from scholars more than people in libraries, but this sort of thing of how could you make these mistakes, like who's doing this? Who are these people? They don't know what they're doing. But a lot of times it's just, you could be an expert cataloger on 18th century mercantile process and be really great at that. And also now they're giving you 19th century American stuff. And beyond that, 19th century African American stuff. So I think a thing that I always push for, and I think is really important, is if we want to do inclusive or representative or whatever adjective we want to say, descriptive work, and that's cataloging and archival description, a commitment needs to be made that work takes more time. And it takes more commitment in terms of resources for time. And obviously time is money. And I think that is always that sort of thing of anti-racist work is not about a workshop or hiring a new person. It's actually about like systematic and operational change. So that is my long technical focused answer. That's not, I never remember which marked fields are which, so.
I think we have time for one more question, and just because I know there's a lot of votes on the one about library cataloging standards, but I think we got a really great answer about actually what I would agree is like a huge problem that sort of even comes before standards is like funding and time, et cetera. And this question is ask a prompt really to talk more about how gender figured into Dorothy Porter's career. And I think that would be our last question because it's 3:58.
Melanie, you want to take that one first?
I forgot I was muted. Sure. So I think gender played an important part in terms of the uniqueness of why she became a librarian in the way in which she did, and then the way in which we even narrate the story of her work within the Moreland Foundation Library's history. Most people recognize Porter started in 1930, but not necessarily recognize that the Moreland Library started in 1914. So it goes a full 16 years of people talking about the ideas of what it is that that this library could be without necessarily getting anything off the ground. So when Porter is appointed curator in 1930, she becomes the person who is then able to manage some of the technical details that go into the building of the collection, but some of the very same people who had been talking about the expansion of the collection did not necessarily give her the credit that was due. So Kelly Miller being one of them, Elaine Locke, he was someone who all along had described this comprehensive bibliography that should be attached to the Moreland Library, but it never actually got off the ground in the way in which he imagined until Porter did it through the WPA, through the WPA program with WPA funding. So I think the way in which we look at her legacy today is definitely incredibly celebratory, but for the time period, so many people were focused forward about how amazing this National Negro Library and Museum could be by the 1930s, that they did not necessarily appreciate the work that she had slowly been doing since 1930, helping to recatalog the collection so that it could be accessible. And so we've also talked a little bit about, but we can expand more on it, about the tendency for women to go into librarianship rather than other historical fields, as was typical for the day, and that if it wasn't for the fact of gender, that she went into this more feminized role as opposed to the historical profession. So I think even knowing how brilliant she was, knowing the kind of work that she was able to do across fields, you can see gender playing a role in the fact that this was filtered through librarianship, and then in many ways she was erased because of it. So that, I think that's,
Well, it's 4 o'clock on the nose. Janet, do you want to offer your perspective and for another minute?
I agree with Melanie, especially on a college campus. You know, it's usually men who are in charge and doing the teaching and things. So she did have a hard time getting things done. But what she did, she made friends of folks. Like I said, she would make sure that she got you information that you would need for your classes and help you with your research and things of that nature. So that was one of the ways that she bridged that gap so that she could get some of her work done. And of course, she was married to the chair of the art department. And of course, she could travel with him when he was doing his artwork in whatever country he was in. You know, she would be there collecting books and things of that nature. So I think that also helped her as far as getting things done.
Well, I'd like to thank all of you today. I feel like we could go on for another half an hour or at least, but everyone has lots of things to do on a Thursday afternoon. So we'll end things here. Thank you again, everyone who joined us today, and especially thank you to our conveners and our panelists. It's our honor to have you, and that's all, folks. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Yeah.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Yeah.